Well, you may have remembered reports and videos of angry parents at school board meetings, upset that their children were being taught critical race theory, being forced to wear masks, or forced to learn at home rather than go to school. The National School Board Association labeled these parents as domestic terrorists for voicing their concerns. And a few days later, Attorney General Merrick Garland of the Biden administration issued a memo to law enforcement stating they would be taking action. Well, what was that action? Did they label parents as domestic terrorists and use the Patriot Act against them? Merrick Garland, in a testimony to Congress, said, no, that's not what happened. But whistleblowers inside the FBI said, that's not true. They were. FBI agent Kyle Seraphin was one of those insiders who blew the whistle by stepping forward to congressional members to reveal that, in fact, there was targeting of parents by the FBI and mass surveillance, not just in this case, but also in many other cases as well. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Cam. Thanks for having me on.
So what was the memo that you were given? First of all, are you still with the FBI? This has been a little unclear when I was trying to look up whether or not you're with them or not. It seems like there's some gray area there.
There is indeed. Yeah. So they think that I'm an FBI employee. I haven't been paid since June 1st. That's when I was indefinitely suspended. It's my contention that constitutes a financial status or a employment status of constructive discharge. So they've done all the things. They took my badge, they took my gun, they took my authorities to arrest. They took my car, my phone, all that thing. So, I say that I don't work for the FBI anymore because they gave me a letter saying that I can't say I work for the FBI anymore. So that's pretty straightforward. But they still send me process and tell me to show up for an interview and say they won't pay me and things like that. So it's kind of screwy. It doesn't really exist anywhere outside of federal employment, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that seems weird. I mean, they're telling you, you don't really work for us, but you still kind of work for us, but we're not going to pay you. I mean, what?
Not only that, they wanted me to fly back to DC and do an interview. And I said, well, I expect to be compensated for the day that I'm, traveling and the day that I'm being interviewed. And they said, well, we can't pay you because you're indefinitely suspended and you don't work here anymore, but we need you to come out and do this interview. So it's very silly, in my opinion. My attorneys are all kind of like, this is not a real status. So I say former FBI employee.
Right. Okay. So what happened that made you come forward about what was going on and what was going on? What did you come forward about?
So there were two things happened at the exact same time. We got a notice that we were going to be forced to get a COVID vaccination shot, which I wasn't going to get done. And that happened in September, the executive order 14043. And then, not more than a couple weeks later, one of my colleagues said, did you get this email? And I didn't know what he was talking about. So he forwards it along to me. And it was never meant for frontline employees, but which is what I was. And it just essentially said that the counterterrorism division, along with the criminal division, and it was signed by the two assistant directors of the FBI in those positions, were going to be looking at parents at school board meetings, and they were going to be tagging any incoming threats under this sort of threat tag, which is like a hashtag. It's just a way to identify intelligence. And it was EDU officials, which a lot of people have seen, and went to Jim Jordan's office. So I brought it to my congresswoman. I made an appointment right away, and I brought it to her on the 27th of October. And it was my belief at the time, and it's still my belief, that there's at least a reasonable case to assume that they committed perjury, that they, being the Attorney General of the United States, may have committed perjury in front of Congress. So that's something that has to be adjudicated. It has to be investigated, whether or not he knew what was going on at the time. And there's people that can do that sort of thing. But it was really troubling for me right up front.
So essentially, these parents were told, the National School Board Association labeled them as domestic terrorists, sent a letter to Merrick Garland, said, do something. And then he writes a memo to law enforcement, FBI, and to other attorney generals saying, okay, we're going to do something. He was really unclear in the memo what he said he was going to do. So I think that allowed him to, when he was testifying, to say, no, we didn't do any of that stuff. We didn't label them as domestic terrorists. Yes, the National School Board Association said it, but we didn't. That's not the language we're using. We're not targeting them in any way. But it sounds like they were being targeted by the counterintelligence, or the counterterrorism, you're saying. It was a counterterrorism unit or counterintelligence?
Yeah, so the counterterrorism division, it was the originator of this particular email. And anybody that says that the FBI is not going to be investigating people based on what the assistant director says doesn't understand what the FBI does. They do investigations. That's the purpose of the FBI. It's literally the Federal Bureau of Investigations. So when somebody gives us guidance about this is how we're going to tag intelligence is stuff that is inside of an investigation. There's really no two ways around that. They can play games with words all day long, and I disagree with that sort of thing. But essentially, after I did this, I had a friend of mine who was also recently suspended, and he came forward with the proof that what we're saying is accurate, which is that there were at least 39 investigations into parents at school board meetings who were reported by people around them. Somebody in their community said this guy owns guns, and we're concerned. And he raised his voice yesterday, and he was angry. And they come in various different forms. Sometimes they're called the e-guardian system, which is the sort of counterterrorism intake. It's for threats to life or threats of violence. But that's our 911 system, and there were e-guardian leads, there were assessments, and so on, and those could grow into full investigations, which is what the FBI does.
So if a parent, let's say I'm a parent and I'm mad, and I would be one of these parents, I'd be up there probably, getting really angry and voicing my concerns at the school board meeting. And so suddenly the process would be that maybe somebody points me out and says, well, she owns some guns, she's speaking all angry at these school board meetings. She might be a threat. We don't know, she might do something. Even though I've never committed a crime, I haven't been committing any crimes, just mad. What kind of investigation would the FBI be doing? Like, would they show up at my doorstep? What would this look like?
It really depends on who it went to and how credible they thought that threat was. So usually those kind of calls go into a place that's called NTOC. It's the National Tactical Operations Center, and that's based in West Virginia. And that's the FBI's 800 tip line. And they also receive all of the emails and the stuff you can go fill out if you go to the FBI's website and submit a tip. Coincidentally, that's where all the January 6th stuff came in, where there were hundreds of thousands of tips coming in. And so they would report you for whatever they think the situation is. And then the FBI agent that was assigned to that particular guardian lead or that particular tip would assess whether or not you were a threat. And they could use any number of tools. They could use surveillance. They could make a phone call. They could come out and do an interview with you. They could do some background research on you, check your social media and things like that. So, there's a number of tools. And then depending on how credible the threat is, kind of determines how many tools that they would have available to them. But a lot of times it's a knock on the door or a phone call to see what you're up to. And then it hopefully goes away, because if it's not an actual federal crime, and that would be that you used like something on the internet to make the threat, if that would be an interstate threat, an interstate communications threat. If that didn't happen, then, it's really hard for the FBI to justify getting involved. But the harassment of having someone knock on your door is real. And they can do that without any kind of case at all.
So would you always know if you were being investigated because you would receive one of these phone calls or a knock on the door? Or or are there cases where people are being investigated and they have no idea at all?
100%. There's definitely cases where people are being investigated and they have no idea. It could be that the threat is not credible up front. It could be that they think the threat is so credible that they're never going to tell you about it until they come and knock on your door with a team to arrest you. So that's a possibility as well. And when I was, working counterintelligence, it was pretty common that we would have these long-term investigations. Sometimes they'd go 5, 6, 10 years. I heard of a counterterrorism case that we worked on that, it went like 23 years, which is crazy. And the person never knew until the day they were arrested. And they weren't arrested for counterterrorism charges. They were arrested for child pornography. So after all that time, they finally found something. And God bless the people that go and get child pornographers. I don't want anyone doing that. That's awful.
Right.
I'm a fair, but a 23-year or a 21-year investigation into you with no allegations of a federal crime until one day, after 2 decades, they come up with something. That's dangerous stuff. That's Banana Republic, secret police stuff.
Yeah. Do you know if any of these parents end up on the terrorist watch lists? I mean, is that what would happen to you if the government was investigating for potential domestic terrorism?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. It's probably unlikely. It would have to be a much more significant threat. I think that you'd had to, have some pretty credible allegations and a specific plan, and they'd have to decide that you were actually going to try to carry something like that out. Nothing's off the table, but it's unlikely that you'd be nominated for one of these watch lists. But then again, there's no requirement of proof to be on a watch list, right? The watch list is literally just, it's about concern. So it really depends on the nominating agent and how they write it up, how they articulate that threat.
Yeah, I think watch lists, I mean, I'm pretty confident I was on one actually right after 9/11. I don't think you have to have done much in order to make it onto a watch list. I know that there was a kid that was 11 years old that wrote like 100 letters to Amnesty International and ended up on a terrorist watch list. It's possible I know I ended up on one because the FBI agent told me I was on one when I asked, but it unclear why, but probably because when I was also about 11 years old, I helped I brought forward legislation, anti-deforest legislation, and this was in the 90s when that was considered a terrorist movement. People were chaining them.
Yeah.
Earth First was like chaining themselves to trees, and so I think they were investigating to find out, oh, is she being backed by? I was just this kid that cared about the environment, and I think they thought somebody was behind it, and who, right? And they wanted to find out. But so I don't think it takes much to end up on one of those watch lists, which makes life difficult if you try to travel. And they put those
Right.
4 S's on your ticket.
Well, and the other, you can have the right name and the right birthday, but you might not be the only person in the world who has the right name and the right birthday that matches that. So you could be the
Exactly.
the absolute wrong, because they don't always go after a social security number, and you're not flying under your social security number. You're flying under your
name. Yeah, exactly. Could be right. Exactly. Could end up on the list because you just have the same name as somebody else who maybe they were investigating or something, which is just really insane. So, it's crazy that these parents were angry parents who had every legitimate reason to be upset would be considered possibly domestic terrorists or investigated for potentially being domestic terrorists because they're angry at what their children are being taught in schools. That's outrageous that the FBI, that our tax dollars are being used in this way, that the school board, the National School Board Association could come out and say, well, we don't like the way they're talking to us. And they're basically tattling to the government, and the government says, well, then we'll look into that and we'll find out, and maybe we'll knock on their door and we'll put a stop to this. Don't you worry. I mean, that just seems insane. So, I mean, were other agents that you were working with, were they also alarmed by this? I mean, why haven't more agents stepped forward and said, I don't really want to be involved in this type of thing. This isn't what I signed up for.
I think there's kind of two sides to that coin. Some people are not being asked to do things like that, or they're not aware of it. Like that email wasn't designed for people that were at my pay grade. I'm a GS-13, or I was. And so that's the frontline, FBI agents that are out there doing the investigations. It was meant for supervisors, but it wasn't even addressed to the supervisors. That was just the decision of my division to send it off to the frontline supervisors. So it could have just stayed in the front office and nobody would have ever heard about it. So there's certainly offices where this wasn't obvious to them. When these Guardian leads come down, we get a lot of them, because if you can imagine, all of the wacky people in the world that have any kind of idea that the FBI could help them, they call. So they get phone calls, every second of every day. There's dozens of people answering these phones. So it's, we get non-credible threats regularly, but to kind of codify it and to give it its own threat tag and say that this is something that we're actually going to be interested in, that was concerning to me. But like I say, not everybody's going to see that. Like, these threat tags are not necessarily obvious to every agent. So that's part of it. The other thing is, it's actually really hard to figure out what to do, because there's plenty of people that, they have mortgages, they got alimonies, they got, kids in daycare, and it's expensive to live without a paycheck, which is what I'm doing right now. So not everybody is willing to go and take that plunge. I think that everybody is obligated to, if they are confronted with that information. But some people don't have the information, and some people aren't going to take the plunge because it's just easier to not.
Is there some sort of financial motivation to this? I'm just kind of thinking, sometimes these government institutions, these entities just grow so large. They've got a lot of employees, similar to like the military industrial complex, for example, where it just gets so big. And we want to end war, but you don't want to cut jobs. So what do? You just create more reasons to keep the machine going so that people don't end up losing their job. I mean, is it that the FBI has just grown so large that they have nothing to do? And so they say, oh, you know what? Let's create a new category of potential domestic terrorists. It's angry parents and people who are, people who support the Second Amendment, or whatever the group might be. Is there a financial motivation to this more than political ideology? Or do you think it's political ideology more so than financial motivation?
It's a very insightful question. I think that it's probably a little bit of both, if we're going to look into it. It's my contention that the FBI sort of did run out of the traditional terrorist mission, and it's a very, very large portion of what the FBI does at this point. Post 9/11, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars worth of funding. The FBI just got a boost in this new omnibus package. It's up to over $11 billion annually. And so, that's a lot of money. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of jobs that are tied into counterterrorism investigations. So I think what happened, and this is a little bit of conjecture on my part, but I think that we started looking overseas for what would traditionally be called the International Terrorism Mission. We're looking for people that are involved in that. And then there's kind of a crossover bridge that happened, which is called homegrown violent extremists. And that's going to be people who sympathize with ISIS or Al-Qaeda or, Al-Shabaab or whatever kind of terrorist organization, but they're from the United States. They're born and raised here, or at least they spent most of their time here, and they're U.S. citizens. And so, once you go from the overseas portion and then you move into this domestic, but it's inspired by a foreign, now you're looking inside of your own house. And that's when we started getting into all these radicalized categories, what we call DVEs, or domestic violent extremists. And that includes anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists, and racially motivated violent extremists. And it just goes down this kind of chain of looking at people that are Americans. I think that they were trying to justify, they justify the budget, and analytical people do that. I mean, they're looking for a reason for us to use our resources. We got a lot of tools. Every government agency wants a mission. So I think that's what was going on. It's a natural kind of mission creep. People who are in the military are familiar with that sort of terminology. They found something, and like you say, nobody wants to be out of a job. So they keep doing it instead of throwing it all into criminal investigations and trying to stop, white collar fraud or, child sex trafficking or something.
Right. I mean, that's just so really you're thinking that from 9/11, just the growth of the Bureau, and then it just kind of, well, okay, we got to keep going somewhere. And which is really exactly what happened with the military industrial complex in a lot of ways. There's money involved, there's jobs, you don't want to cut the jobs, people need to stay employed. So you just kind of make up a reason for them to remain relevant and useful and important.
And there's software, there's things the Bureau buys. I mean, there's millions and millions of dollars of investment in tools that are, developed by outside companies. And some of those companies have other FBI agents working at them now. We're finding out in the Twitter files that people are working over there. That's not surprising to me. I would even, add a new term to your lexicon, which is the information industrial complex. When you're in the intelligence world, you deal with information. It's natural you'd go to an information driven business, whether it's Google or Facebook or Amazon or Twitter. There's a lot of money that goes back and forth, cloud computing contracts. So there's a ton of money involved. When you're talking about billions of dollars, and the FBI is just one part of the intelligence community. The DHS, I think, has $120+ billion budget, and so there's a significant amount of money that's going back and forth, plus a lot of jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this or if you have a hunch, but my hunch in looking at the Twitter files and everything that's been revealed is that with all of these FBI agents, like I call them supposed former FBI agents working over at Twitter, and apparently in other I would imagine big tech sectors, are they truly former? I mean, my thinking is, how can there be why would there, for one, be so many FBI agents working over at Twitter? Are they truly former, or are they kind of pretending to be former and they're assigned to go in there and basically spy on these big tech companies?
I think they retire into those jobs. So there's a couple of different parts of the headquarters entity. It's called the intelligence branch. People can look that up on the org chart that's on the FBI's website. And they have an office of the public sector and an office, I think, of public engagement or partner engagement. So there's two real big pieces of the headquarters units that go out there and they talk to companies. There's, national initiatives called InfraGard, where they send agents to liaison with, different businesses. So they are developing their retirement gigs like at that time. They're setting up their eventual kind of move from the public sector into the private sector. And I don't think they report to the FBI at all. If there is a clearance involved, the FBI probably holds their clearance. It's kind of an unspoken rule that they will, give them that courtesy. But think about this: if you spend 20 to 25, maybe 30 years working for any company, you're going to be kind of loyal to that company, and your friends are all going to be there. So the interplay doesn't have to be official. It doesn't have to be that they ask you to do anything. You're naturally going to be defending the reputation of something like the FBI if that's where your professional experience came from, because your reputation is tied to their reputation. And so, the Jim Baker seeing over there, he doesn't need to be told to look out for the FBI's interests. Like, that's what he's been doing for 30 years. It's just natural to them. And it doesn't have to be insidious. And it should also be really clear that, there's some decent people that go over and get those jobs. I'm aware of at least one on the list of the 20 or so that they kind of outed, that someone said they knew that was a friend of mine. And they said, yeah, that guy's a good guy. I mean, he's a good person. So it's not all nefarious. I don't like the idea of like hunting down, ex-FBI agents that went to go get these jobs, but it's something we need to be aware of. And so there's a difference between they shouldn't be guilty just because they're there. But if their actions, are nefarious, then obviously we should be very concerned. So it's something we have to keep an eye on as a
It's
country.
just odd that they are there. And as a normal person, I just don't think that it makes sense that an FBI agent would then go and work for Twitter. I mean, help make that make sense to me.
Sure. Well, most times I think they're actually hired because of who they know. It's just like anything else in these industrial complexes. You don't hire a retired three-star general because he knows the most about aircrafts. Like he probably doesn't know very much about it at all anymore. He's a manager or a logistics guy, but he knows all the guys that sign the bill and sign the contract, that engage, whether it be a logistics or a parts contract or supply or something like that. And in the same way, a lot of these former FBI folks that are senior, they've got connections all over DC. They spend a bunch of time at headquarters, so they've got Washington DC connections, I would believe. And then the other thing is there's always been kind of a historical transfer from high-end law enforcement, the top of law enforcement agencies, going in to do security work. So if it's a security position and they, maybe they oversaw security, then it's not totally unnatural. But like I said, it has the potential of being really bad. So we got to be aware of it. But it's not on its face incriminating. It's just one of those. It's one point, and we just have to see what the other points are. If they make a line, then we draw right to where it goes.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of similar. I guess, you're right. It's not necessarily on its face nefarious or illegal or something, sinister going on there, just like when Congress people leave Congress and become lobbyists, right? They go
Yeah.
to K Street, they transfer right on over. And it's just, but obviously the issue lies in it's who they know, how they use that information and whatnot. And that obviously becomes dangerous in many cases. It can be. So,
Yeah.
um,
And those public engagement jobs, I mean, they're pretty much staffed with what we call KMA, which stands for Kiss My A. And it's people that are ready to retire. So they're setting those jobs up to go over and do that kind of work. So it's not unreasonable in the Bureau. And I used to work with people, that were on the edge of retirement or that hit their 20-year mark and they were, punch their paper anytime they wanted. Some of them want to go and just golf. I'm not mad at them for doing that. Some of them want to go do PI work, but once you've kind of done federal investigations where you have all the tools, it's not nearly as fun. So unless you're going somewhere that has, the same sort of resources or something similar, why would you go do the same job you just left? But, some people can't live on their pensions. The pension is maybe somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 a year. And they get a little bit from Social Security. So plenty of people want to go supplement that income. I mean, it's like I said, it's not totally nefarious on its face, but we got to keep an eye on it for sure.
right. It can be.
And these people can obviously work against the American public's interest if they're censoring speech, which is what we did see.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Kyle. Well, thank you so much for joining us. How can people follow you and hear more about, all of these great stories that you have? Or I shouldn't say great stories because sometimes they're not so great, right? They're scary stories or enlightening stories or stories we certainly should know. So how can people find you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So they can find me on Twitter. They can find me on Truth Social. I have the same handle and everything. I've got a Rumble channel and you can find our channel there. And they're all the same. It's at Kyle, Kyle. My last name's Seraphin, S like Sierra, ERAPHIN like November.
All right. The Kyle Seraphin Show is how people can listen to you. So, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, Kim.